From 1900 to 1902, the Anglo-Boer War concentration camp set up by the British pervaded with gruesome conditions. The leaking tents, inadequate food and water, fatal diseases, and the lack of prime necessities tragically caused over 28,000 deaths to innocent Boers. Nonetheless, this soon became a notable triumph of the men, women, and children when a fearless, persistent fighter protested against her very own government, shared the innocent Boers' predicament to the world, and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. This beloved traitor was Emily Hobhouse. The Boer War had begun in 1895 when the Outlanders in the Transvaal planned a revolt against the Boer government. Their goal was to overthrow the Boers Republic and to replace it with a British-run government. Leander Jameson with the small British force joined the Transvaal with the idea of aiding their revolt. However, communication was lacking and plans failed when all telegraph lines were not cut as had been planned. Consequently, the Boers received warning of the attack and Jameson and his troops were forced to surrender. The angered Boers, who were the descendants of the Dutch settlers, led by their president Paul Kruger, began to prepare and arm themselves. In 1899, they invaded the Natal and the Cape, two of Britain's colonies, and besieged British forces at Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. The British responded by capturing Bloemfontein and Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal. Commander Herbert Kitchener then became the new commander of the British forces. He soon realized that the success of the Boers heavily relied and depended on the support from the civilian populations. Thus, he proposed the establishment of concentration camps where the Boer children and women would be confined to interrupt such supply lines. The new camps tragically had an extremely high death rate due largely to the lack of medical services. In Britain, Emily Hobhouse was working in the South African Conciliation Committee where she organized meetings to protest against the war. It was late in the summer of 1900, she wrote, that I first learned of the hundreds of Boer women that became impoverished and left ragged by our military operations. The poor women who were being driven from pillar to post needed protection and organized assistance. The cruel, agonizing camps shocked Hobhouse, and she was set to obtain permission from the government to start the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund. Once the fund began to receive donations and subscriptions, she met with Alfred Milner, a British colonial administrator, and gained permission to visit the concentration camps. Hobhouse landed in Bloemfontein on January 24, 1901, and there were almost 2,000 people at the concentration camp. The majority were women and children, along with surrendered men. The camp system was a wholesale cruelty, pressing hardest on the children, and there was insufficient, unsuitable food. Families were separated, and many were in conditions they did not have the strength to endure. What most distressed the women at the camps were the sufferings of their undernourished children. Sicknesses such as measles, bronchitis, pneumonia, and typhoid had already invaded the camp with fatal, tragic results. There were very few tents that did not house one or more sick person, most of them being children. But Hobhouse was determined to change the path that her own government was paving. She was determined to have soap listed as a necessity, along with more straw, tents, and kettles. She even distributed clothes herself, applied for the appointment of additional nurses and medical equipment for the camp, and supplied mattresses for pregnant women. Over the next few weeks, Hobhouse visited several camps to the south of Bloemfontein. Everywhere she would consistently direct the attention of the authorities to the inadequate sanitary accommodations and food rations. The appalling increase of illness and death and the fact that the military authorities did not bother to listen to her pleas led to her decision to return to England. She hoped that once there she would be able to persuade the British government as well as the public to make an end to the tragic conditions that she had witnessed. Immediately after Hobhouse arrived in England, she submitted a request to the Minister of War to deliver her report that she had recorded during her stay in the concentration camps. Her compelling report consisted of the unhealthy conditions, including descriptions of the unbearable weather like dust storms and thunderstorms. There were heartbreaking stories of women at the camps and descriptions of the extreme bare food rations of barely 3 pounds of food and drinks per day. But Hobhouse was rejected by the House of Commons as they argued that the intern Boers were content and comfortable and stated that everything possible was being done to ensure satisfactory conditions in the camps. Despite the fierce opposition from newspapers supporting the government's stance, Hobhouse continued pleading the cause of the women and children in South Africa. She continuously arranged and addressed meetings, and from this, more funds were made available. Eventually, in August of 1901, the government was compelled to appoint a ladies' committee that would visit the camps in South Africa. The established commission, headed by Melissa Fawcett, was to visit South Africa to examine the living conditions, mortality, and birth rates in the camps. The Fawcett Commission visited almost every concentration camp in South Africa. The Fawcett Commission returned back from the camps 2 months later and reported and confirmed almost everything that Emily Hobhouse had stated. A report had concluded that each month an average of around 3,000 Boers had died from the horrendous conditions such as starvation, disease, and exposure in the concentration camps. With the Ladies' Committee and Emily Hobhouse's report, the House of Commons concluded that there were 3 causes of the high death rate: the insanitary condition of the country caused by the war, causes within the control of the inmates, and causes within the control of the administration. With that, on May 15th, 60 delegates from Britain took part in a 3-day conference in Vereeniging, where complicated negotiations continued between Boer and British delegates up to the end of May. And on May 31st, 1902, the Boer and British leaders signed the Peace Treaty of Vereeniging. Later, in 1905, after the war ended, Hobhouse went back to South Africa where she set up rehabilitation projects such as schools to teach lace-making, spinning, and weaving. Eventually, 27 schools were established all over the country, and by giving instruction personally for more than 3 years, she carried out the task she had set for herself, helping to successfully rebuild the Boers' lives. In addition, she proved to the world that during war, it was crucial to treat the opponent's inmates humanitarianly. After Hobhouse exposed the tragic results from tactical failings during the Boer War, the British Army underwent numerous changes such as individual marksmanship and army organization in order to ensure that such a war did not take place again. Its goal was for no other war to involve such harsh treatment to the inmates of the opposition, a triumphant step of the development of warfare despite the tragedy of the Boer War concentration camps.
Insofar as she's remembered today, it is for the conflict that occurred between her and the British government over the issue of the government's behaviour in the South African War of 1899 to 1902. She was, throughout her life, really only interested in the facts about how warfare affected ordinary people. So there are many thousands of people who really owe their lives to her concern and her intervention.
Shortly after Emily Hobhouse died on June 8, 1926 in London, Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian activist, wrote a tribute in Young India, his weekly newspaper. Gandhi described Hobhouse using words such as brave, courage, true heroine, and noblest. Her perseverance created a legacy, and she became an honorary citizen of South Africa for her humanitarian work there. This conflict of Boers being discriminated against by their own government is something that Hobhouse shared to the world about. We are still experiencing this pertinent topic today. In 2012, South Africa's then president, Jacob Zuma, sang Kill the Boer during the African National Congress's 100th anniversary. This prolonged, horrifying discrimination is a symbol of the sustained hatred towards the Boers, causing over 450,000 white South Africans to be living in poverty today. But such abhorrence could be seized with the strength and courage that Emily Hobhouse had shown. Her personality had shown the world a lot about what women could do. Despite her disadvantage legally with her rights as a woman, she still ensured that her voice was heard and argued against the government's actions. She proved that it was vital for people to fight and protest against what is wrong and to stand up for what is right.